Slawski, Volschina, Kopciuch, another Slawski. There certainly are a good number of swords coming out of Poland these days by some excellent blacksmiths. Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, and today I'm reviewing another sword by one of those Polish blacksmiths. No, it's not the Golden Dream by Damian Slawski. That one's still waiting for 1,000 subscribers. If you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? You know what to do. Instead, today I'm reviewing this arming sword by Maciej Kopciuch. I apologize for my pronunciation of all these Polish names. I am terrible at it. So, who is Mr. Kopciuch? Well, he is a Polish blacksmith and historian. He does a lot of research into historical swords, studying the originals, publishing articles about them, and really getting into the nitty-gritty details of what makes medieval swords work. Most of the swords he makes are representative of those that were used between the 10th and mid to late 15th century. Now, Mr. Kopciuch tries to make his swords as authentic to the originals as possible, while still using modern techniques. In addition to swords, Mr. Kopciuch has partnered with another Polish blacksmith whose name I can't pronounce, so I will put it on the screen up here. And they have created medieval axes on Facebook. I will put a link to it in the description. So looking at the characteristics of this sword, this would be classified as an oakshot type 12 sword, which generally speaking was used between the 13th and 14th centuries. Swords of this type typically are broad at the base with an even profile taper and a fuller that runs most of the length of the blade and a lenticular cross-section. They were cut-focus swords, but with the more acute point than you'd seen in previous medieval swords, they had more thrusting ability as well, though certainly nothing like later medieval swords with extremely acute points. Now this is a particularly large and powerful version of a Type 12. It probably would have been most effective on horseback, though that's not to say it couldn't be used on foot, where it would be paired with a nice big shield. The sword does feature a scabbard, which was created by Mr. Kopciuch. There is pretty much no rattle in it whatsoever. Excellent retention. And that goes both ways if I put it in. Still, no rattle, perfect retention. It's dyed this beautiful blue color with a deep red belt, and it features Steve's personal sigil, crest, whatever you want to call this, on it. And that's about the only decoration other than these, I forgot what the actual terminology for these decorations are, but the belt has a few of them. And a nice chape on the end. I think that would be considered a chape. It is stitched up nicely along the back, and the rain flaps are stitched as well. My only real complaint about this scabbard is the lack of a chape. To me, it just looks a little odd. It would be really nice to have a bronze chape here. Now, hopefully you can see this, but it does wear actually very easily, very securely. This is not going anywhere. I can take the sword out pretty easily. Putting it in is going to be a little tricky, but I'm not very practiced at this, so. But yeah, this is actually quite secure on my belt and doesn't really get in the way as much as you might think it would. Let's take a look at the hilt now, starting with the pommel. This is a brass pommel with a silver cross inlaid on both sides. It's frankly gorgeous. It looks amazing. The silver really sets off the brass very nicely. It is peened to the tang, and one thing that is common to Mr. Kopciuch's swords is that he doesn't clean the peen up like crazy. It still has some rough marks on it, and that's just one of his style choices. This is representative of an oakshot type H pommel, which is a pretty simple shape. Although there is a little dimension here, it does taper in thickness from the grip down to the peen. It gets a little bit thinner there, which is a nice touch. One thing to note is that there are absolutely no sharp edges on this pommel. It's been smoothed over very nicely. The grip is your, what I would say, typical medieval grip with a wood core, leather wrap, and cord texture on it. One nice thing is that this is an octagonal shape, which is extremely comfortable. I really enjoy that style, that shape for grips. The risers here are pretty well defined, although not quite as crisp as something you'll see from like Albion or so. But it is a very comfortable grip. I have an excellent time indexing the blade, no problem at all. And the transitions from the grip to the pommel and to the crossguard are perfect. The crossguard is pretty much an Oakshott Type 6. It's a pretty thin one actually. It doesn't have much beefiness to it at all. But there is some dimension to it. It does taper in thickness here, starting thicker at the grip and then tapering out towards the ends of the quill ends. The gap in the crossguard is certainly a lot bigger than you'll see on other high-end production swords such as Albion. But, it doesn't affect the actual functioning of the sword at all. And personally, I would prefer to see those gaps a bit smaller, but it's more of a aesthetic thing than functionality. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's the measurements I took of it. So as you can see, this is a broad blade starting at 2.5 inches thick at the crossguard, and for the first 24 inches, it tapers pretty much exactly 1/4 inch every 6 inches. And then as it gets towards the point, it starts tapering a bit more rapidly. It also starts at about 4.5 millimeters thick with a very gentle distal taper to just around 3.5 millimeters around the end of the fuller and most of the sweet spot before tapering extremely quickly towards the tip into about 1.75 millimeters. This leads to a sword that is pretty damn flexible, if I do say so. Let me show you that. Flexible, but not wobbly. That's the important thing. Yes, it does, when I'll get to this more in the handling part, but it does have some wobble to it. But it's to be expected for this type of sword. And one of the most interesting and prominent things you'll notice on the sword is the inlay on it. It has 2 different phrases in Latin on it. I can't pronounce Latin, so I will put it up here for what they actually say and the translations. But one side says, "In the name of God," and the other side says, "Actions, not words," which I believe is a slogan, kind of a slogan of Steve's. The inlay is done beautifully. It is completely smooth. There, you feel it, but it's not like jagged or anything like that. It's just beautiful inlay. And one thing that Mr. Kopciuch says that I think is actually important is that while you see these kind of inlays on historical swords, they weren't purely decoration. In fact, they weren't decoration first. Medieval people thought these inlays, these crosses, this kind of stuff would bring power to them, would defend them, would bring God's power into the weapon. So these inlays were, while they were decorative, they were also considered part of the effectiveness of the weapon. Now, one of the aesthetic decisions Mr. Kopciuch makes is to not go for an absolutely perfect finish. There are small flaws here and there that don't affect the functionality and give the sword a bit more of a handmade look. One thing I will say though is this is a nice satin polish. There's no doubt it's a very nice polish. But a sword of this stature in historic times would have been a knight's sword, a lord's sword, something like that. And I think it probably would have been mirror polished because they liked the shininess. Another decision that Mr. Kopciuch makes in regards to authenticity is the fullers. These are very well finished. They are very straight. They finish in a very gradual transition into the lenticular cross-section, but they don't end on the same place on both sides. There's definitely probably a good 1/2 inch to inch difference. Medieval people didn't care about symmetry as much as we do in the modern world, so that wouldn't really bother them, and it's something that Mr. Kopciuch does in his swords, not worrying quite as much about modern sensibilities. He wants to create swords that if you took them back to medieval times, they would fit right in. Let's talk about the edge sharpness. First off, this is a beautiful geometry. It is one smooth bevel all the way from the center of the sword out to the edge. But frankly, it's just not that sharp. If I take it to a piece of paper, it doesn't really cut much. I can do a little tearing sometimes, but it's not very sharp. It really could be sharper. And, some people think that medieval swords were not very sharp because there's this weird reputation that medieval swords have of being heavy, clunky, bashing objects. That's not the case. Medieval swords needed to be sharp. To be able to cut through an Akaton, arming jacket, gambeson, anything like that, you need very sharp swords. Scallagrim has done some videos showing this, and I will provide a link in the description to that. I'm not going to be doing any actual test cutting with this sword, as it's not mine, but let's talk about handling next. This is a big, heavy one-hander, which, as you can probably guess based off of the few arming swords I've reviewed of Steve's recently, that's the kind of sword he likes. Being honest, it's not the kind of sword that is my type of sword. I much more prefer agile long swords, but that doesn't mean I can't appreciate a heavy sword. This is not as big, as powerful as maybe the Tritonia or the Mateusz Solowski that I reviewed recently, but this is definitely a big Type 12 that is designed to have a good amount of power to it. So, when you move it out there, you definitely feel that. You definitely want to continue the motion where possible. You don't want to really try to stop the cut too much because there's enough weight pulling it that gets a little uncomfortable. But it's balanced right around at 5.5 inches, right around there. And it feels pretty good at that. It certainly has authority in the cut, like I was saying. Definitely feels better to do that than to stop the cut there. And if you're noticing when I'm doing this, it does wobble. I won't say wobble, but it definitely flexes during those cuts quite a bit, which is pretty typical for a sword with a lenticular cross section. This is not a particularly thick sword. It starts at like around 4.5 millimeters thick, gets down to about 3.5 around the sweet spot, and then tapers down under 2 millimeters right near the tip. So this is not a thick sword, so it's not going to be incredibly stiff. But that's, like I said, that's normal for a lenticular sword. What that does mean is you need to have good edge alignment when you're cutting, because if you're off, when it impacts the target, if your edge alignment, if you're going at a 45-degree cut, but your sword's not, it's just going to wobble around and bounce off the target and not cut. And the flexibility of these swords does mean that it's even more important to have your edge alignment right on, because if it's flexing while you're actually impacting, it's going to be less likely that you're going to have the perfect angle for a good cut. But overall, it feels the way I've said this before on the Mateusz Solowski sword, on the Tritonia. It feels the way a sword should feel. It's heavy, it's intended to be a powerful cutter, but it doesn't feel clunky. It feels heavy intentionally, which is what you want out of this kind of sword. The grip feels good in the hand. I don't feel any hot spots anywhere, no matter which side I grip it on. And even more than that, the pommel. This has been smoothed over so perfectly that there's not even the hint of a ledge here. It's so nicely, I won't say rounded, but just so refined that there's just no way this pommel could dig into your hand. That's a really nice touch that you don't really see. Even on higher end swords, they usually have much crisper lines, and even if those are chamfered a little and smoothed over, the fact that they are pretty crisp means they do still have the potential to bite into your hand a little bit. This one does not at all. So now it's time to talk bottom line. Is this sword worth the price? Well, first off, what's the price? Steve said he paid roughly 1,900 euros for this sword, and to me, yes, it's worth that price. This is a beautifully crafted sword with some amazing attention to detail. Something about Mr. Kopciuch's swords really do capture the essence of a medieval sword. So while I do wish this sword was sharper, yes, I do think it's worth it. And in fact, the handling I've done of this sword, this review process, has excited me enough about Mr. Kopciuch's work that I have started a commission with him for a longsword for myself. And that's going to wrap up this review. Thank you for watching, and until next time, Alien Toot out.